please don't leave me like this.
I'm done. I can't do this anymore.
What are you doing? She needs you.
I'm leaving. Don't follow me.
No, please.
She thought the hospital bed would expose his heart. Instead, it exposed his hunger. When Grace Whitmore pretended to be sick, she expected her husband, Adrian, to panic, hold her hand, and prove the marriage still had a pulse. But Adrian only checked his watch, signed her in like unwanted baggage, and rushed away to marry his wealthy boss, Vivian Blackwood, the mistress who promised him power, luxury, and a life without his poor, fragile wife. While Grace lay under white sheets, listening to every word through a hidden phone, Adrian's mother stormed through Grace's bedroom, selling her clothes, jewelry, letters, and the old locked trunk she mocked as trash. None of them knew the truth. Grace was not poor. She was the secret heir to a $10.8 billion empire, hidden behind a quiet name, a plain wedding ring, and years of painful silence. And the belongings they sold for pocket change were not junk. They were proof, evidence, and the final key to destroying every lie. By sunset, Adrian had a new bride. By midnight, Grace had their confessions. By sunrise, they had nothing left but regret. And by then, it was far too late to beg for mercy. Grace Whitmore looked unconscious when her husband, Adrian, rolled her wheelchair through the hospital doors. Her face was pale, her hands were limp, her wedding ring hung loose on her finger like it no longer belonged there. Adrian bent close, pretending to whisper comfort. But what he really said was, "Stay here, Grace. For once, don't ruin my future." His phone buzzed. On the screen was a name Grace had seen too many times: Vivian Blackwood, Adrian's rich boss, his mistress, and the woman waiting for him in a white dress. Vivian's message read, "The efficient is here. Leave her and come marry me." Adrian didn't even hesitate. He signed Grace into the hospital under emotional exhaustion, kissed her forehead for the cameras, then walked outside and told his mother, Nora, "She'll be stuck here for hours. Go to the house and sell whatever she has left. Vivian doesn't want poor wife junk in our new life." But the moment Adrian disappeared, Grace opened her eyes. The nurse beside her whispered, "Mrs. Whitmore, are you sure you want to continue?" Grace slowly removed the oxygen tube she didn't need. Then she looked at the phone hidden beneath her blanket, where Adrian's every word had been documented by her legal team. Grace smiled through her tears and said, "Yes, today he marries his mistress. Tonight he finds out who I really am." What Adrian didn't know was that the poor wife he abandoned at the hospital was the hidden heir to a $10.8 billion fortune. And what his mother didn't know was that the belongings she was selling for pocket change contained the final proof Grace needed to destroy them legally, publicly, and permanently. By sunrise, Adrian would have no wife, no mistress, no job, no reputation, and no family home. Only regret. Scene 1, the wife who looked weak. Grace Whitmore had spent 6 years being treated like a charity case in her own marriage. Adrian's mother, Nora, often said, "My son could have married someone with a future." Adrian never defended Grace, not once. He allowed Nora to mock Grace's thrift store dresses, her quiet voice, her old wooden jewelry box, and the antique trunk she kept locked beneath the bed. To everyone, Grace was just a soft-spoken woman with no parents, no money, and no connections. But there were signs that something about her did not fit. She never panicked over bills. She always knew legal language before a lawyer explained it. She carried herself like someone trained to hide power, not someone born without it. One night, Grace overheard Adrian arguing with Nora in the kitchen. Nora whispered, "Vivian Blackwood is giving you a real chance. Grace is dead weight." Adrian replied, "I know, but I need the divorce clean before Vivian's father's board meeting." Grace froze behind the hallway wall. That was the first time she realized Adrian was not just cheating. He was planning. Later that night, Adrian handed Grace a stack of documents and said they were insurance forms in case her health ever failed. Grace saw the word divorce buried under legal phrasing. She did not confront him. Instead, she signed one page with a slightly altered signature, the same way her late grandfather had taught her to mark documents when she suspected fraud. Flashback: Grace was 12, sitting in a private library with her grandfather, Edmund Carlyle. He placed a fountain pen in her hand and said, "Never stop a snake too early, Gracie. Let it crawl far enough that no one can deny what it is." Back in the present, Grace folded the documents and smiled weakly at Adrian. Adrian thought she was fooled. But the next morning, Grace called Richard Hale, her family attorney, and said, "Start documenting everything." Scene ending, cliffhanger. Richard asked, "Including the Blackwood woman?" Grace looked at Adrian's phone lighting up beside her and replied, "Especially her." Scene 2, the mistress with a deadline. Vivian Blackwood was not just Adrian's boss. She was elegant, ruthless, and used to buying loyalty from desperate men. At Blackwood Meridian, Adrian was only a senior finance manager, but Vivian made him feel like royalty. She gave him private lunches, expensive watches, and whispered promises about making him executive partner once they married. But Vivian had her own pressure. Her late father's trust required a major board review before she could fully control the company. Vivian believed a respectable marriage would make her look stable, polished, and untouchable. Adrian was useful because he was handsome, ambitious, and obedient. The only problem was Grace. Vivian did not fear Grace because Grace appeared poor. Vivian despised Grace because Adrian still hesitated whenever Grace cried. So Vivian created a test. She told Adrian, "If you can walk away from her when she needs you most, I'll know you're ready to stand beside me." That line became the fuse. At home, Adrian began pushing Grace emotionally. He ignored her meals. He stopped wearing his wedding ring. He let Nora move into their home and slowly take over Grace's space. Nora began boxing Grace's things under the excuse of decluttering. One afternoon, Nora found Grace's antique trunk. Inside were old dresses, letters tied with black ribbon, a cracked porcelain horse, a small velvet pouch, and a faded photo of a young Grace standing beside a mansion gate. Nora laughed. Poor people always keep trash like it's treasure. She did not notice the crest engraved on the trunk latch. The same crest was stamped on the private legal files Richard Hale was preparing. Scene ending, cliffhanger. That night, Grace received a message from Richard. "The forged divorce filing has been accepted into the court system. We now have proof. But if you want the full conspiracy, you need one final test." Scene 3, the fake illness that was really a trap. Grace did not fake a dangerous emergency. That would have been reckless. Instead, she used something Adrian already believed about her, that she was fragile. For months, Adrian had told people Grace was emotionally unstable, so he could make her look unreliable during the divorce. Grace turned that lie into bait. With Richard's guidance and her longtime physician aware she only needed observation for stress and exhaustion, Grace allowed Adrian to believe she was having a serious episode. She made herself look weaker than she was. She spoke softly. She clutched her chest only enough to worry him. She let her hand tremble when Vivian called. Adrian saw inconvenience, not a wife. That was the point. At the hospital, Grace watched him perform concern for the nurses. He said, "My wife has been unstable lately. I'm doing everything I can." But once the nurse stepped away, Adrian leaned down and hissed, "You picked the worst day to collapse." Grace whispered, "What's today?" Adrian's eyes flickered. For 1 second, guilt appeared. Then his phone buzzed again. "Vivian, the car is outside. Choose." Adrian stood. He told the nurse, "I have an urgent business obligation. Call me if she gets worse." Then he walked out of the hospital. Grace's eyes stayed closed until his footsteps disappeared. The nurse pulled the curtain. Richard Hale stepped inside, carrying a leather folder. He said, "He left you within 7 minutes." Grace's lips trembled, not from sickness, but from heartbreak. "Was any part of him real?" she asked. Richard did not answer. He only placed a document beside her. It was the schedule for Adrian and Vivian's wedding ceremony. Scene ending, cliffhanger. Grace stared at the venue time, then said, "Let him say I do." That's when we close the door. Scene 4, Nora sells the wrong woman's belongings. While Adrian raced toward Vivian, Nora entered Grace's bedroom wearing rubber gloves, like Grace's belongings were contaminated. She brought a second-hand dealer named Mr. Pike and told him, "Take everything. Clothes, boxes, the trunk, jewelry. My son is marrying up today." Mr. Pike opened Grace's jewelry box and found plain-looking items: a pearl hairpin, an old brooch, a watch that no longer ticked, and a thin gold bracelet with initials engraved inside. Nora said, "Fake, all of it." She sold the entire box for less than the price of Vivian's wedding shoes. Then she dragged out the antique trunk. Mr. Pike paused when he saw the crest. "Where did she get this?" Nora shrugged, "Probably stole it from some estate sale." Inside the trunk was the real emotional spine of Grace's life. Flashback: Grace at 16, standing in the rain at her grandfather's funeral. Edmund Carlisle's attorneys explained that her identity would remain sealed because several relatives had tried to exploit her inheritance. Her fortune would be protected in trust until she chose to reveal herself or until a spouse attempted financial abuse, fraud, or coercion. Her grandfather had left her one instruction: marry for love if you can, but before you share your name, learn who loves you without it. Grace had loved Adrian without revealing the Carlisle name. Adrian had loved the version of her he could control. Back in the bedroom, Nora found a bundle of letters. She was about to throw them away when one envelope slipped open. The letter began, "My dearest Grace Carlisle." Nora frowned. Before she could read further, her phone rang. Adrian shouted through the speaker, "Mom, hurry. Vivian wants the house cleared before tonight." Nora shoved the letters into the trunk and sold it. She had no idea those letters connected Grace to the Carlisle estate. She also had no idea Mr. Pike had been warned by Grace's legal team to report anyone selling items with that crest. Scene ending, cliffhanger. As Nora counted the cash, Mr. Pike secretly took a photo of her and sent it to Richard Hale with one message: she sold the Carlisle trunk. Scene 5, the wedding built on a lie. Vivian's wedding was not romantic. It was strategic. The room was filled with executives, investors, and people who smiled like cameras were always watching. Adrian arrived late, still wearing the suit Grace had ironed for him that morning. Vivian noticed the hospital visitor sticker on his sleeve. She peeled it off and said, "Don't bring her into my wedding." Adrian laughed nervously. "She's handled." That line reached Grace minutes later through a message from Richard's investigator, who was legally present among the event staff. Grace sat upright in her hospital bed. For the first time, she cried. Not loud, not messy, not helpless. Just one tear. Because until that moment, some tiny part of her had hoped Adrian would turn around. He did not. He stood before Vivian and repeated vows about loyalty, partnership, and honesty. Every word was a knife, because Grace knew their marriage was not legally clean. The divorce Adrian submitted was built on manipulated documents, a marked signature, and false statements about Grace's mental condition. The wedding ceremony looked glamorous. But legally, it was a trap Adrian had walked into himself. During the reception, Vivian announced Adrian's promotion in front of everyone. "Starting tomorrow, my husband will oversee the Blackwood Meridian Acquisition Committee." Applause filled the room. Adrian smiled like he had finally escaped poverty. Then his phone buzzed. A message from Grace. Only 5 words. "Did you enjoy my hospital?" Adrian's smile faded. Vivian leaned in. "What is it?" Adrian looked across the room, suddenly uneasy. Because Grace had never called any place my anything before. Scene ending cliffhanger. Before Adrian could reply, every screen in the reception hall went black. Then one name appeared in gold letters. Carlisle, Holdings, International. Scene 6, the name they should have recognized. Vivian's face changed first. She knew Carlisle Holdings. Everyone in that room knew Carlisle Holdings. It was the private investment empire rumored to control hospitals, hotels, shipping contracts, medical patents, and silent shares in half the companies Blackwood Meridian wanted to impress. Adrian did not understand at first. He whispered, "Why is this on the screen?" Then a pre-recorded message began. Not from Grace. From Edmund Carlisle, her late grandfather. His voice filled the reception hall. "If this message is being played, my granddaughter Grace has chosen to reveal her identity because someone close to her mistook kindness for weakness." A photo appeared. Young Grace beside Edmund Carlisle. Then another photo. Grace as an adult signing trust documents. Then a number appeared. Estimated Carlisle trust value, $10.8 billion. The room went silent. Adrian stepped backward like the floor had moved. Vivian stared at him. "Your wife is Grace Carlisle." Adrian whispered, "She never told me." Then Richard Hale appeared on the screen live. He said, "Correction, Mrs. Grace Carlisle Whitmore did not hide assets from her husband. Her inheritance was protected by a premarital trust established before the marriage. Mr. Whitmore was informed in writing that certain family matters were private. He chose fraud, abandonment, and bigamy instead." Adrian's mouth opened, but no words came out. Vivian turned on him instantly. "You told me she was unstable and broke." Adrian snapped, "That's what I thought." That answer destroyed him more than any accusation could. Because everyone heard the truth. He had not left Grace because she was poor. He had left because he believed she was poor. Scene ending cliffhanger. Then Richard said, "And Mrs. Whitmore's belongings were sold from her home less than 1 hour ago. We have the receipt, the photos, and the witness." Nora's name appeared on the screen. Scene 7, Nora learns what she sold. Nora was at home when the first police-style legal notice arrived by courier. Not an arrest. Worse for her pride. A civil preservation order. Everything she sold had to be recovered, every dollar documented, every buyer named. Nora called Adrian screaming, "What did that girl do?" Adrian shouted, "Mom, what did you sell?" Nora looked at the empty corner where Grace's trunk had been. For the first time, she felt fear. Meanwhile, Grace left the hospital quietly through a private exit. She was not wearing designer clothes. She wore the same simple dress Adrian had mocked that morning. But outside the hospital, 3 black cars waited. Richard opened the rear door. Inside was the pearl hairpin Nora had sold, already recovered from Mr. Pike. Grace touched it gently. Flashback, Grace's mother, whom she barely remembered, brushing Grace's hair before disappearing from her life during a family legal war. "Your grandfather will protect you," her mother said, "but one day you must protect yourself." Grace had spent years hiding because protection had felt safer than power. Now hiding had cost her love, dignity, and almost her name. Richard said, "We recovered most items, the trunk is secure, the letters are intact." Grace asked, "And Nora?" She signed the sale receipt under her own name. Grace closed her eyes. "Good, I don't want revenge built on rumors, I want it built on proof." Scene ending, cliffhanger. Richard hesitated, then said, "There is one more problem. Vivian is trying to claim Adrian deceived her too. She wants a private settlement before morning." Scene 8, the mistress was never innocent. Vivian tried to save herself. She arrived at Grace's family office after midnight, no longer in her wedding dress, but still wearing the diamond necklace Adrian had bragged about buying with future bonus money. Grace met her in a conference room with glass walls and no warmth. Vivian looked at Grace and said, "Adrian lied to both of us." Grace said nothing. Vivian continued, "I had no idea who you were." Grace finally replied, "But you knew I existed." Vivian's confidence cracked. Grace slid a folder across the table. Inside were messages Vivian had sent Adrian. "Leave her at the hospital. Make sure your mother clears the house. Once the divorce is final, we'll erase her from the story." Vivian stopped breathing for a second. Grace said, "You didn't know I was rich, but you knew I was his wife." Vivian tried another angle. "You can't ruin Blackwood Meridian over personal heartbreak." Grace leaned forward. "This stopped being personal when you put my husband on an acquisition committee while secretly having an affair with him. That is corporate misconduct. This stopped being heartbreak when your company used my false medical narrative to question my competence. That is defamation. And this stopped being private when your wedding guests applauded a marriage built on forged divorce papers." Vivian's face went pale. Grace then revealed the deepest twist. Carlyle Holdings had been the silent party preparing to rescue Blackwood Meridian from a financial crisis. Without Carlyle money, Vivian's empire would collapse under debt her father had hidden. Vivian whispered, "You were the buyer." Grace answered, "I was the lifeline." Then she closed the folder. "And now I withdraw." Scene ending, cliffhanger. Vivian stood shaking as Grace added, "But Adrian still doesn't know the worst part." Scene 9, Adrian comes back to the woman he threw away. By dawn, Adrian was no longer smiling. His promotion was suspended. His wedding to Vivian was under legal review. His divorce from Grace was being challenged as fraudulent. His mother was facing a civil claim for selling Grace's property. And Blackwood Meridian's board wanted his name removed from every document. So Adrian did what weak men do when ambition fails. He went back to Grace. He arrived at the Carlyle office holding flowers. Red roses. Grace stared at them. Flashback, on their first anniversary, Grace told Adrian she hated red roses because they reminded her of apology without change. Adrian had laughed and said, "Flowers are flowers." Now, years later, he had brought the one flower that proved he had never truly listened. Adrian fell to his knees in the lobby. "Grace, I made a mistake." Grace looked down at him calmly. "No, Adrian, you made a choice. A mistake is forgetting a birthday. You left your wife in a hospital bed to marry your mistress." He cried, but Grace saw what his tears were attached to. "Not love. Love." Adrian said, "I didn't know you were Grace Carlyle." Grace's voice broke slightly. "That is the only honest thing you've said." He reached for her hand. She stepped back. "You were supposed to love me before the name." Then Nora entered behind him, trembling. Her makeup was smeared, her pride was gone. She said, "Grace, please, I didn't know those things mattered." Grace turned to her. "They mattered because they were mine." Nora whispered, "We're family." Grace replied, "Family does not sell your memories while you are in a hospital." The lobby went silent. Then Richard handed Adrian the final documents. Annulment challenge. Fraud complaint. Corporate ethics report. Property theft claim. Withdrawal of Carlyle acquisition support. Immediate removal from all accounts connected to Grace's trust. Adrian's hands shook as he read. "This will leave me with nothing." Grace answered, "No, Adrian, it will leave you with exactly what you earned." Scene-ending cliffhanger. As Adrian looked up, Vivian appeared at the entrance, and she was not there to apologize, she was there to blame him. Scene 10, nothing but regret. Vivian stormed into the lobby and slapped Adrian's flowers out of his hand. "You told me she was nobody." Adrian snapped back, "You told me to leave her." Nora screamed, "Both of you ruined my son." Grace watched them turn on one another like people trapped in a room with the truth. That was her final confirmation. She did not need to destroy them with cruelty. Their greed would finish the work. Grace allowed the legal process to unfold. Vivian lost control of Blackwood Meridian after the board discovered the hidden debts, the affair, and the misconduct surrounding Adrian's promotion. Adrian was terminated for ethics violations and became unemployable in the circles he had betrayed Grace to enter. Nora had to repay the value of Grace's belongings and surrender the house Grace had quietly helped Adrian purchase through a protected marital loan. The wedding video that was supposed to prove Adrian's rise became the evidence of his downfall. Weeks later, Grace returned to the small home she once shared with Adrian. It was empty now. No Nora shouting from the kitchen. No Adrian's suits hanging like trophies. No boxes where her memories used to be. Richard asked if she wanted the place sold. Grace walked into the bedroom and saw the antique trunk restored at the foot of the bed. She opened it. Inside were the letters, the pearl hairpin, the old photo, and her grandfather's final note. Power is safest in the hands of someone who knows what betrayal costs. Grace finally removed her old wedding ring. She did not throw it away. She placed it inside the trunk, not as a memory of love, but as evidence of the woman she survived being. Months later, Carlyle Holdings opened a foundation for abandoned spouses, financial abuse survivors, and women rebuilding after betrayal. Grace gave the opening speech. She said, "I once thought hiding my power would help me find real love, but real love does not require you to be powerless first." In the crowd, Adrian stood behind a security barrier, thinner, older-looking, and completely alone. Nora stood beside him, clutching a worn purse, unable to meet Grace's eyes. Vivian was nowhere to be seen. A reporter asked Grace, "Do you regret not revealing your fortune sooner?" Grace looked toward Adrian one final time. Then she smiled softly. "No, if I had revealed it sooner, they would have loved the money and hidden the truth. I needed to know what they would do when they thought I had nothing." Adrian lowered his head. Nora began to cry. And Grace walked away, not with revenge in her heart, but with peace. Because in the end, she did not leave them with nothing. They still had one thing. Regret. Final emotional payoff. Adrian abandoned Grace because he thought she was worthless. Nora sold Grace's belongings because she thought Grace had nothing worth protecting. Vivian stole Grace's husband because she thought Grace had no power. But Grace's quietness was not weakness. It was patience. And by the time they discovered the truth, every cruel choice they made had already become evidence. Here's a 2,000-word epilogue that continues Grace's story with emotional closure, consequences, and a final powerful payoff. 6 months after the scandal, Grace Carlyle no longer flinched when cameras flashed. At first, every public appearance had felt like walking through broken glass. Reporters wanted the same thing from her that Adrian, Nora, and Vivian had once wanted: access, a piece of her pain, a quote sharp enough to turn into a headline, a photograph of the billionaire heiress who had pretended to be sick and exposed the husband who abandoned her at the hospital. But Grace had learned the difference between being seen and being consumed. So she chose when to speak. She chose where to appear. And most importantly, she chose what part of the story belonged to the world and what part still belonged to her. The Carlyle Renewal Foundation had grown faster than even Richard Hale expected. What began as a legal support fund for abandoned spouses and financial abuse survivors became something larger, something living. Every week, letters arrived from people Grace had never met. Some were written in careful handwriting on lined paper. Others came by email at 3 in the morning, full of misspellings, fear, and hope. A few had only one sentence. "I thought no one would believe me." Grace kept those letters in a locked cabinet beside her desk, not because she wanted to collect pain, but because she never wanted to forget why the foundation existed. It was not built to polish her name. It was not created to make the public admire her strength. It was built because Grace knew how easily a cruel person could turn someone's quietness into evidence against them. The foundation's main office did not look like an empire. Grace had refused marble floors, grand staircases, or anything that might intimidate the people walking in. The walls were warm cream, the chairs were soft, and the reception desk had a small sign that read, "You are safe here, start where you can." The first time Grace saw that sign installed, she stood in the lobby for almost 5 minutes without speaking. Richard found her there. "Too much?" he asked. Grace shook her head. "No, it's exactly enough." He studied her carefully, the way he had since she was a girl, hiding behind her grandfather's library doors. "You know Edmund would have been proud." Grace smiled faintly. He would have pretended not to be. Richard chuckled. "Yes, then he would have corrected the font size on the sign." Grace laughed for the first time that morning, and the sound surprised her. It came easily now sometimes. Not always, not every day, but often enough that she trusted it. Healing had not arrived like a grand sunrise. It came in small, almost ordinary moments. The first morning, she woke up and did not wonder what Adrian was doing. The first time, she cooked dinner only for herself and did not feel the empty chair like an accusation. The first time, she passed a flower shop, saw red roses in the window, and felt nothing but mild dislike. The first time she signed her name as Grace Carlyle without feeling like she was stepping out of hiding and into danger. Still, some wounds had echoes. On quiet nights, she sometimes remembered Adrian standing in the Carlyle lobby with roses in his hands, insisting he had made a mistake. She remembered how badly she had once wanted his apology, how many years she had waited for him to say, with honesty and without excuse, that he had hurt her. When the apology finally came, it had arrived too late to matter. That was one of the cruelest lessons Grace had learned. Sometimes the words you needed most lose their power because the person saying them destroyed the place inside you where they would have landed. Adrian tried to contact her twice after the final decree. The first time, he sent a letter through his attorney. Richard read it before passing it to Grace, then warned her, "You do not have to open this." Grace opened it anyway. The handwriting was Adrian's. She recognized the sharp slant, the way he pressed too hard on certain letters when emotional. He wrote that he was sorry. He wrote that he had started counseling. He wrote that losing her had forced him to see the ugliness in himself. He wrote that he did not expect forgiveness, but he hoped one day she would believe he had truly loved her. Grace read the letter once. Then she placed it in a plain envelope and filed it away, not in the antique trunk, but in a legal archive box marked resolved. That was where it belonged. Not with her mother's hairpin, not with her grandfather's notes, not with the old photographs and letters that held the roots of who she was. Adrian was no longer part of her sacred history. He was part of the case. The second time he tried to contact her, it was through a charity event. He bought a ticket under another person's name and stood near the back of the room, thinner than before, wearing a suit that no longer looked like armor. Security noticed him immediately. Richard asked if she wanted him removed. Grace looked across the room and saw Adrian staring at a wall of foundation photographs. Women receiving keys to new apartments, men attending financial literacy workshops, children drawing in the family waiting area while their parents met with attorneys. Adrian was not crying, he looked worse than that. He looked like he finally understood that Grace had turned the ashes of their marriage into shelter for strangers. "Let him stay," Grace said. Richard frowned. "Are you sure?" "Yes, but he doesn't get near me." Adrian stayed for 20 minutes, then he left without approaching her. Grace never asked where he went after that. She heard pieces, of course. It was impossible not to. Adrian had lost his job permanently after the ethics review. Several firms rejected him quietly. One smaller company hired him briefly, then let him go when clients complained. He eventually took work far below the status he had once chased, doing contract accounting for businesses that did not care about his old ambitions. There was a time when Grace might have felt guilty hearing that. Now she felt only a sober kind of distance. Adrian was not starving, he was not helpless. He was living with consequences, and consequences were not cruelty. Nora's life changed too. That had been harder for Grace to process. Nora had sent no apology at first, only accusations through lawyers. She claimed confusion, stress, maternal panic. She insisted she had not known the items were valuable, as if value were the only reason not to sell another woman's belongings. But 3 months after the house was sold, a small package arrived at the Carlisle office. Inside was a teacup. Grace recognized it immediately, pale blue porcelain, chipped near the handle. It had belonged to a set Grace bought during her second year of marriage, back when she still believed creating a home meant slowly filling it with gentle things. Nora had hated the cups and called them old lady dishes. Apparently, she had kept one. There was a note wrapped around it. "Grace, I found this while packing. I almost threw it away because that is what I used to do with things that reminded me of you. I am returning it because I understand now that something does not have to matter to me to matter to someone else. I was cruel to you. I cannot fix what I did. Nora." Grace held the note for a long time. It was not enough. But it was something. She did not write back. Instead, she placed the teacup in the foundation's staff kitchen, not as a symbol of forgiveness exactly, but as a reminder that even the ugliest chapters could leave behind one small useful thing. Vivian Blackwood disappeared from public life for a while, but women like Vivian rarely vanished completely. Her removal from Blackwood Meridian became official after the board investigation concluded. The company survived, but not as her kingdom. Carlisle Holdings purchased several divisions during restructuring, preserving thousands of jobs under new leadership. Grace insisted that every public statement focus on employees, not revenge. Vivian fought the removal until the very end. Then, one morning, Richard placed a news clipping on Grace's desk. "Thought you should see this." Grace glanced at it. Vivian had started a private consulting firm under a shortened version of her name. No photograph, no grand interview, just a quiet business registration and a rented office suite. Grace handed the clipping back. "Is she violating any agreements?" "No." "Then let her rebuild whatever life she can." Richard raised an eyebrow. "That is more mercy than she offered you." Grace looked toward the window. Mercy is not always for the person receiving it. That was something she had come to understand slowly. Revenge had given her back her voice, but mercy protected what was left of her heart. She did not need Vivian destroyed forever. She needed Vivian removed from the power she had abused. That had been done. The rest belonged to Vivian and whatever conscience she did or did not develop. The antique trunk remained in Grace's private study, beneath the window where morning light touched its brass corners. She opened it less often now. At first, she had opened it every day, as if checking that her memories had not been stolen again. Then every week. Then only when she needed to remember the difference between grief and identity. One evening, nearly a year after the hospital, Grace came home from the foundation exhausted but peaceful. A storm had passed earlier, leaving the windows streaked and the air clean. She made tea, carried it into the study, and sat on the floor before the trunk. For a while, she did nothing. Then she opened it. Her wedding ring still rested inside. It looked smaller than she remembered, less powerful. Strange how an object could once control the rhythm of an entire life and later become only metal. Beside it lay Edmund Carlyle's final note. Power is safest in the hands of someone who knows what betrayal costs. Grace picked up the ring. She did not cry. That surprised her. She waited for pain to rise, for anger to burn, for some last unfinished ache to ask for attention. Nothing came except memory. Adrian laughing at the charity auction. Adrian kissing her forehead in their first apartment. Adrian looking away when Nora insulted her. Adrian leaving the hospital. Adrian nailing with red roses. All of it belonged to one story now, not separate versions, not the good man and the bad man, just Adrian, complicated and weak and hungry for a life he thought someone else could hand him. Grace had loved him. He had betrayed her. Both things were true. She placed the ring back, but not in the same spot. This time, she put it beneath the foundation charter, under the papers that represented everything built after him. That felt right. Her phone buzzed. A message from Denise, the nurse from the hospital. First emergency housing family moved in tonight. 2 kids. Their mother cried when she saw the room, thought you'd want to know. Grace read it twice. Then she pressed the phone to her chest. That was the answer. Not revenge, not headlines, not Adrian's regret. This. A woman with 2 children, unlocking a door no abuser could open. A mother crying because safety finally had walls. Grace looked at the trunk and whispered, "Thank you, Grandpa." For the first time, the old room did not feel haunted by warnings. It felt guarded by wisdom. The next morning, Grace visited the new housing center. She went without cameras, wearing jeans, a soft sweater, and her mother's pearl hairpin. Children's drawings already covered one hallway wall. A little girl with curly hair sat at a table, coloring a horse beneath a star. Grace stopped when she saw it. The girl looked up. "Do you like horses?" Grace smiled, "Very much. My mom says this place helps people start over." "It does." The girl held up the drawing. "Then the horse is running to a new home." Grace's throat tightened. "That's beautiful," she said. The girl studied her. "Are you sad?" Grace almost gave the polite answer adults give children. Instead, she said, "Not today." The girl nodded as if that made perfect sense. "Good, you can have this one." She handed Grace the drawing. Grace accepted it with both hands. Later, back in her office, Grace framed the picture and placed it above her desk. The horse was uneven, the star too large, the colors wild and imperfect. It was worth more to her than the red roses Adrian had brought, more than the diamond necklace Vivian wore, more than every object Nora had dismissed as junk. Because this had been given freely. No manipulation, no hunger, no hidden price. Just a child saying, "You can have this." That evening, Richard came in and noticed the drawing. "A new acquisition?" he asked. Grace smiled, "Priceless." He stood beside her, looking at it. After a moment, he said, "You seem different." Grace turned to him. Different how? Lighter. She thought about that. Maybe she was. Not because the past had vanished, but because she had finally stopped carrying it like a debt. Adrian's betrayal was real, but it was not the whole of her. Nora's cruelty had wounded her, but it had not defined her. Vivian's arrogance had exposed something ugly, but it had also pushed Grace into the open, where her power could finally serve more than secrecy. For years, Grace had believed her inheritance was something to hide from people who might misuse her. Now she understood it could also be something to use for people who had been hidden. 1 month later, she stood in front of the old house one final time. It had been sold to a young couple with a baby. Grace had approved the sale quietly after learning they wanted a garden and a sunny room for the child. She did not meet them. She did not need to. It was enough to know the house would hold laughter again. Before leaving, she walked to the front porch. There were no traces of Adrian, no sign of Nora, no ghost of Vivian waiting in a white dress somewhere beyond the life Grace had lost. Just a house, a door, a place she had survived. Grace placed a small envelope beneath the porch mat for the new owners. Inside was a note. May this home be kinder to you than it was to me. Fill it with truth. Then she turned and walked back to the car. Richard waited by the curb. Ready? He asked. Grace looked once more at the house. For years she had thought closure would feel dramatic, like a door slamming, like fire, like victory loud enough to silence every doubt. But closure felt quieter than that. It felt like leaving without needing anyone to watch. Yes, she said, I'm ready. As the car pulled away, Grace did not look back. Not because the past meant nothing. Because it no longer owned her. Somewhere Adrian still lived with regret. Nora still lived with shame. Vivian still lived with the knowledge that she had lost an empire by underestimating a woman she thought powerless. But Grace was no longer building her life around what they had lost. She was building it around what others could still recover. And in the end, that became her truest revenge. Not that Adrian had nothing. Not that Vivian fell. Not that Nora finally understood the worth of what she had sold. Grace's truest revenge was that she became impossible to reduce to the woman they betrayed. She became the door someone else could walk through. She became the proof that silence could turn into testimony, that pain could turn into protection, and that a woman abandoned in a hospital could rise with enough grace to build a place where no one had to be abandoned again. And every morning after that, when sunlight touched the antique trunk in her study, Grace remembered the lesson hidden inside all along. They had mistaken her quietness for weakness. But quiet things could still endure. Quiet things could still remember. And when the time came, quiet things could still change the world.